The hollow choir. The train pulled into the station with a groan of metal and steam, its breath clouding the already oppressive air. I stepped onto the platform, my boots crunching against the warped wooden planks. The station, if it could still be called that, was little more than a shack listing to one side, its peeling paint the color of old bones. No sign bore the town's name. On the map, it was Halford, though it looked more like a place forgotten, even by the passage of time. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, but beneath that, something else lingered. A faint metallic tang like blood diluted in rainwater. It clung to my senses, more tasted than smelled, and settled uneasily in the back of my throat. I adjusted my satchel, feeling the reassuring weight of my notebooks and books against my side. They were my armor, a defense against the gnawing unease that had taken root the moment I stepped off the train. My purpose here was clear: to study the folklore of forgotten places, to document the whispers that survived only in the recesses of isolation. Halford was supposed to be just another dot on my map, but something about this place felt different, and not in a way I could articulate. The town stretched before me like a question that didn't want to be answered. Houses sagged against one another, their shingles warped and rotting. Windows stared back at me, dark and unwelcoming. The streets were cobbled but uneven, as though the earth beneath them had begun to give way. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a single sharp note that died as quickly as it rose. The Hollow Hearth Inn stood near the center of town, a structure that might once have been grand. Its wooden sign creaked on rusted chains, the paint faded and chipped. I hesitated at the threshold, staring at the door as though it might swing open of its own accord. The stillness around me was suffocating, the kind that made you feel watched even when no eyes could be seen. I pushed the door open, and a bell above it chimed weakly. The warmth inside was immediate, though not welcoming. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. The innkeeper stood behind the counter, his hands folded neatly before him. He was tall and thin, with a face that seemed to blur at the edges, as though my mind refused to hold on to its details. "You'll be wanting a room, then?" His voice was quiet, almost polite, but there was a strain beneath it, a tension I couldn't place. "Yes," I replied, setting my satchel on the counter. "For a few days, maybe longer." He nodded and pulled a thick ledger from beneath the counter. "Name?" I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. My name seemed suddenly distant, as though it were someone else's entirely. My voice faltered. "Lewis, Dr. Lewis." The innkeeper's pencil scratched across the page, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "Room 2, he said, sliding a tarnished key across the counter. "Second floor, end of the hall. Dinner's at 6. As I reached for the key, his hand lingered, his knuckles pale against the wood. "Don't get lost," he added, his voice quieter, as though the words were meant more for himself than for me. The room was small, though not unpleasant. The bed creaked when I set my satchel down, the mattress sagging in the middle like an old man's spine. A single window looked out over the square, though the view was obscured by fog that pressed against the glass like a living thing. I lit the lamp on the bedside table, its flame flickering against the shadows that clung stubbornly to the corners of the room. I unpacked slowly, methodically, a notebook, its pages half filled with observations from other towns. A book on regional folklore, its spine cracked from use. A small leather case containing pens and a pocket watch, the latter ticking softly in the stillness. As I placed them on the desk, I caught my reflection in the mirror above it. I looked tired. No, more than tired. I looked worn. The lines around my eyes seemed deeper than I remembered, and my skin had taken on a pallor that didn't suit me. I tried to shake the thought, but the mirror held my gaze longer than I intended, as though the reflection was waiting for me to notice something I didn't want to see. The sound of children's laughter broke the silence, thin and distant. I turned to the window, squinting through the fog. In the square below, 3 children ran in circles near the fountain, their shapes blurred by the haze. Their movements were strange, disjointed, as though their limbs didn't quite belong to them. One of them stopped abruptly and turned toward me, their face hidden by the fogged glass. A shiver crawled up my spine. I turned away from the window and closed the curtains. Dinner was a quiet affair. The dining room was dimly lit, its chandelier swaying faintly despite the absence of any breeze. The other guests were few, a wiry man with hollow cheeks who stared into his coffee like it might reveal the future, and an older couple who whispered to one another as though afraid their voices might shatter the air. I sat near the end of the table, avoiding the fire's flickering light. The stew was warm but tasteless, the kind of meal that filled the stomach but left the tongue dissatisfied. The innkeeper moved silently between the tables, his presence a shadow that passed too close without ever touching. The wiry man spoke first, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "New here, aren't you?" I nodded, unsure whether to respond. "Don't stay long," he added, not looking up from his coffee. "Why not?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He shrugged, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the table. "You'll see." The words lingered long after the conversation ended, sinking into the air like smoke. I didn't sleep well that night. The mattress was thin, the pillow lumpy, and the room too quiet in the way that amplifies every creak of the wood, every sigh of the wind. The fog outside pressed against the window like a living thing, and I caught myself glancing at it too often, expecting what? A face, a shape. The hum started just before dawn. At first, I thought it was the sound of the inn settling, wooden beams shifting as the cold set in. But as I lay there, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling, I realized it was deeper than that, a low vibration that seemed to rise from the floorboards and pulse through the walls. It wasn't constant either, but rhythmic, rising and falling like the breath of some unseen thing. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound wasn't loud, but it was insistent, and the longer I focused on it, the more it seemed to move through me, resonating in my chest. It wasn't coming from the room itself, but seemed to seep through the structure of the building, as though the inn were a conduit for it. I scribbled a note in my journal. Low hum, rhythmic, source unknown. The words felt inadequate, but they were all I could manage. The morning was no better. The fog hadn't lifted, and the square below was shrouded in a pale grey haze. I sat by the window, sipping bitter tea and watching the fountain. The children were back. They moved in loose, aimless circles around the dry basin, their movements slow and strange. One of them, a boy, maybe 8 or 9, stopped suddenly and crouched by the fountain's edge, pressing his ear to the stone. He stayed like that for several minutes, unmoving, as though he were listening to something only he could hear. I leaned forward, my hand on the glass. As though sensing me, the boy looked up. His face was obscured by the fog, but even from this distance, I could feel his gaze piercing through. Then he ran. The other children followed without a word, their feet barely making a sound against the cobblestones. The innkeeper wasn't in the dining room when I came down for breakfast, though I could hear movement in the kitchen. The wiry man was there, sitting in the same seat as the night before, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the table. I hesitated, then sat across from him. "Did you hear it last night?" I asked. His fingers froze mid-tap, and he looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Hear what?" "That hum. It started just before dawn." The color drained from his face. He glanced toward the kitchen, then leaned closer. "Don't talk about it," he whispered. "Why not?" He shook his head, his fingers resuming their tapping. "You'll make it worse." "Worse how?" My frustration was growing. "What is it?" His mouth opened, but before he could answer, the innkeeper appeared in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his presence silenced the conversation like a slammed door. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone neutral, but with an edge I couldn't quite place. "Fine," the wiry man muttered, lowering his gaze to his coffee. The innkeeper lingered for a moment longer before disappearing back into the kitchen. By midday, I found myself standing in front of the widow's house. It was smaller than I expected, tucked at the edge of the town like an afterthought. The shutters were drawn, and the air around it felt heavier, colder, as though the house itself exhaled a quiet dread. I knocked twice. The sound echoed dully, swallowed by the fog. The widow opened the door on the third knock. She was younger than I'd imagined, 40s perhaps, but her face carried the weight of someone much older. Her skin was pale, her eyes sunken, and her mouth drawn into a tight line that spoke of grief too deep to express. "You're the new one," she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Dr. Lewis, I don't care." she interrupted, stepping aside to let me in. Her house was as sparse as the inn, the furniture worn but meticulously arranged. A single chair stood by the empty fireplace, its back facing the room. "I wanted to ask you about your husband," I began carefully, unsure how to proceed. She froze, her hands tightening on the back of the chair. For a moment, I thought she might order me to leave. But then she spoke, her voice quieter now. "I can't remember him." Her words startled me. "What do you mean?" She turned to face me, and for the first time her mask of composure cracked. "I know I had a husband. I know we lived here, but I can't remember his face. I can't remember his voice. It's like he was never here." "Do you think something happened to him?" I pressed gently. Her hands trembled. "I don't know. Sometimes I think I hear him, at night, beneath the floorboards." The word sent a chill down my spine. That night the hum returned. It was louder this time, pulsing through the walls like a second heartbeat. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight with the weight of it. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, pressing against me, filling the room with something I couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of my being. I reached for my journal, desperate to capture the sensation, but as I opened it, I froze. The words were already there. "Don't look down." The handwriting was mine, but I didn't remember writing it. My breath quickened, and I stared at the page until the letters blurred. Beneath me, faint but deliberate, came the sound of footsteps. I didn't move for what felt like hours. The footsteps were faint, deliberate, each one pressing against the silence like a weight. They stopped, started again, and then stopped altogether, leaving only the hum, a low, persistent vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind. Old buildings creak, and sound travels strangely in forgotten places like this. But even as I thought it, I couldn't bring myself to believe it. The journal remained on my lap, open to the words I didn't remember writing. "Don't look down." When sleep finally came, it was shallow and fitful, filled with fragmented dreams. I was standing in the square, the fog pressing against my skin like damp cloth. The fountain bubbled, though its basin was empty. Shadows darted at the edges of my vision, elongated shapes with faces I couldn't quite make out. A voice whispered my name, soft, melodic, and far too close. When I woke, the hum was gone, but the sense of wrongness lingered. The morning brought no clarity. The fog had thickened overnight, swallowing the square and the streets beyond. The children were absent, their laughter replaced by an oppressive silence that felt almost deliberate. The inn was equally subdued. The wiry man was hunched over his coffee again, though his fingers didn't tap this time. They were still, his hands clasped tightly around the cup, as though it might slip away. "Did you hear it last night?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. His eyes flicked to mine, bloodshot and wide. "I told you not to talk about it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" I pressed. "The hum, the footsteps. What's happening here?" He shook his head, his grip tightening on the cup. "You don't want to know." "Maybe I do." The innkeeper appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. "Enough," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "No more talk of this. You'll scare the guests." I almost laughed. There were no other guests, not anymore. The older couple from the night before was gone, their seats conspicuously empty. I hadn't seen them leave, and the thought sent a chill down my spine. The wiry man slumped back in his chair, defeated. "You can't stop it," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "It's always been here." I needed answers, and I knew where to start. The widow's house was as I'd left it, cold, silent, and shrouded in fog. The shutters were still drawn, and the air around it felt heavier than ever. I knocked once, twice, but there was no reply. The door was unlocked. Inside, the house was unnervingly still. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something sweeter, almost cloying. The chair by the fireplace stood exactly where it had before, its back to the room like a figure keeping vigil. I stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under my weight. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the silence. No reply came, but the hum returned. A faint vibration at first, building slowly until it pulsed through the floorboards. It seemed to be coming from beneath me, deep within the foundation of the house. The widow's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes I think I hear him, beneath the floorboards. I knelt by the fireplace, running my fingers along the edges of the rug that covered the floor. It was old and threadbare, its pattern worn to near invisibility. Beneath it, the wood was scratched and uneven, the faint outline of a trapdoor barely visible in the dim light. I hesitated. Every rational instinct screamed at me to leave, but something deeper, something I couldn't quite name, urged me on. Slowly, I pried the trapdoor open. The air below was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of damp earth and rot. A narrow staircase led into the dark, the steps slick with moisture. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. I descended slowly, my lantern casting long shadows against the uneven stone. The tunnel at the bottom was narrow, the walls damp and glistening. Shapes jutted from the dirt, half-buried objects that seemed almost deliberate in their placement. I knelt to examine one, brushing away the soil. It was a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked, one eye missing. Beside it lay a pocket watch, its glass shattered, the hands frozen at midnight. My stomach turned as I uncovered more, a rusted wedding band, a pair of broken spectacles, a faded photograph of a family I didn't recognize. These weren't just objects, they were relics. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now. At the end of the tunnel, the dirt gave way to stone, its surface etched with deep grooves that looked almost like carvings. I moved closer, my lantern trembling in my hand. The faces emerged slowly, one by one, pressed into the stone like fossils. They weren't complete, distorted and half-formed, their features stretched and warped. Eyes stared out, wide and unseeing, mouths frozen in silent screams. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The hum shifted, becoming something else, something almost melodic. A voice, 100 voices, 1,000, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. One of the faces moved. It turned toward me, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. Its mouth opened, and though no sound came, I felt the words vibrate through my skull. Sing. The lantern slipped from my hand, shattering on the stone floor. Darkness swallowed me whole, and the hum rose to a deafening crescendo, drowning out the sound of my own screams. I woke to silence, the kind that feels alive, the kind that listens. It wrapped itself around the room, pressing against my ears, filling the air where the hum had been. The fog outside was thicker now, its milky tendrils clawing at the edges of the window. My breath misted the glass as I leaned closer, peering into the square below. It was empty. No children, no movement, just a stillness that felt deliberate, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The memory of last night sat heavy in my chest, the faces in the stone, the widow's words, the hum rising like a crescendo until it swallowed me whole. I tried to ground myself in logic, to compartmentalize, but the details slipped through my grasp. My notes offered little comfort, just fragments, disjointed phrases that read like the ramblings of a fevered mind. Don't look down. It knows you. The song bends everything. The dining room was quieter than usual, though not for lack of people. The wiry man was there, his coffee untouched, his hands trembling at his sides. Two other guests, a man and woman I hadn't seen before, sat near the hearth, whispering to one another in voices too low to hear. The innkeeper moved among us with his usual detachment, his eyes fixed on some distant point I couldn't see. I sat across from the wiry man, my curiosity outweighing my unease. He didn't look up. It's getting worse, I said softly. His fingers twitched. It always gets worse. Tell me what it is. The hum, the faces, all of it. He shook his head, a hollow laugh escaping his throat. You think you want to know, but you don't. Knowing doesn't help. It just makes you... He trailed off, his gaze darting toward the kitchen door. It makes you hollow. What does that mean? He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. You should leave, before it notices you. It? His expression tightened. The singer. The square was emptier than it had any right to be. The fog had swallowed the edges of the town, leaving the fountain as the only visible landmark. It was a pale monolith against the grey, its surface worn smooth by time. I approached it cautiously, the sound of my boots on the cobblestones unnaturally loud in the stillness. Something glinted near the fountain's edge. A doll's arm, porcelain and delicate, lay half buried in the mud. The sight of it sent a chill crawling up my spine. I reached for it, but stopped as a sound reached my ears, a faint melodic hum, rising and falling in waves. It was coming from the fountain. I took a step back, my heart pounding. The hum grew louder, resonating through the air like the pluck of a taut string. Shadows danced across the surface of the dry basin, long and distorted. One of them turned, its head tilting toward me in a way that felt deliberate. I stumbled back, the shadows retreating into the fog as quickly as they'd come. The hum faded, leaving only the faint rustle of the wind. I spent the rest of the day wandering the town, though I'm not sure what I hoped to find. The streets were a labyrinth, twisting and rearranging themselves the moment I turned a corner. Houses I'd passed before appeared in new places, their windows staring back at me like blind eyes. I ended up at the widow's house without realizing I'd been walking there. The shutters were still drawn, and the air around the building felt colder, heavier, as though the house itself was exhaling something toxic. I knocked once, twice. No answer. I pushed the door open. The chair by the fireplace was empty now, its back facing the door like a sentinel. The trapdoor in the corner was sealed, but the rug that had once covered it was gone, leaving the wooden slats exposed. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the faint, sweet scent of decay. I approached the trapdoor cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the edge. The hum returned, faint but insistent, vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and distant, rising from below. Lewis. My name. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place. The voice was familiar, achingly so, though I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. Lewis, it called again, a lilting melody that twisted my name into something unrecognizable. The floor shifted beneath me, the wood groaning as though under some immense weight. The trapdoor rattled, and for a moment I thought I saw something press against it from below. A faint, shapeless outline, moving in time with the hum. I ran. That night the hum came closer. It filled the room, vibrating through the walls like a pulse. The lantern flickered, its light casting jagged shadows across the ceiling. I tried to block it out, pressing my hands over my ears, but it was inside me now, threading through my thoughts like a needle pulling thread. The journal sat open on the desk, the words on its pages shifting and blurring before my eyes. It bends the mind. It bends the world. Sing. I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The hum grew louder, resonating through my chest, my teeth, my skull. Shadows stretched across the room, their shapes twisting and writhing like smoke. And then, as suddenly as it began, the hum stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. I turned toward the door, my pulse thundering in my ears. The footsteps started again, deliberate and slow, moving toward my room. The footsteps stopped outside my door, the silence as thick and stifling as the fog outside. I sat frozen on the edge of the bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. The hum, now absent, had left a void, a hollow quiet that pressed against my thoughts, filling them with questions I didn't want to ask. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate rapping. 3 measured taps, each one carrying a weight that didn't belong to it. "Who's there?" I managed, though my voice cracked on the words. No reply. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The door loomed, its wood warped and darkened with age, and for a moment I felt as though it might breathe. The air shifted, heavy and expectant, and I couldn't tell if it was colder or if my own fear was pulling the heat from my body. The knock came again. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The metal was cold under my fingers, and as I turned it, the silence pressed harder, as though the act of opening the door might shatter something fragile. The hallway was empty. The inn felt different as I stepped into the corridor. The wood beneath my feet creaked louder than it should have, and the shadows stretched long and unnatural, bending away from the faint flicker of the wall-mounted lanterns. "Hello?" My voice echoed back to me, distorted, like a whisper that didn't belong. I walked towards the stairs, my footsteps slow and cautious. The dining room was dark, the hearth extinguished, the chairs neatly tucked under the tables. The silence followed me, deeper now, heavy with an almost physical weight. As I reached the foot of the stairs, I saw the door to the widow's room. It was ajar, a faint light spilling into the hallway. I shouldn't have gone to it. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to return to my room and lock the door. But the curiosity that had brought me to this forsaken place wouldn't let me. I pushed the door open. The widow sat in the center of the room, her back to me. A single lantern rested on the floor beside her, its flame flickering against the shadows that crowded the walls. She was hunched forward, her hands folded in her lap, her shoulders rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. "Mrs. Carter?" I asked softly, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath my weight. Her head tilted slightly, as though she'd heard me, but she didn't turn. The hum began again, faint and rhythmic, vibrating through the floorboards. "I can hear him," she said suddenly, her voice low and hollow. I stopped. "Who?" Her head tilted further, her hair falling across her face. "My husband. He's singing to me." The hum grew louder, rising and falling like a melody, its rhythm steady and deliberate. I could feel it now, resonating through my chest, threading through my thoughts. "He's here," she continued, her voice taking on an almost melodic quality. "Beneath the floorboards. Can't you hear him?" I stepped closer, the hum pulling at me, compelling me forward. She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her face. Her eyes were wide and empty, her pupils blown out, her expression frozen in something that wasn't quite fear. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, her gaze fixed on some point beyond me. And then I saw it, the shadow on the wall behind her. It stretched long and thin, its head too angular, its limbs impossibly distorted. It didn't belong to her. It didn't belong to anything human. The hum crescendoed, filling the room with its weight. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as the shadow began to move, its limbs bending and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. "Sing," the widow whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum. I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. The hum followed me, fainter now but still present, vibrating through the walls like a living thing. I grabbed my journal, desperate to ground myself, to anchor my thoughts. The pages blurred before my eyes, the words shifting and twisting into something incomprehensible. I blinked hard, focusing, and the text settled into something familiar. "You're not alone." My breath hitched, and I dropped the journal. The hum swelled, the shadows on the walls growing longer, darker, until they consumed the edges of the room. And then from beneath the bed, I heard it. A whisper, soft, melodic, and achingly familiar. It was my own voice, humming the tune. The humming was my voice. I knew it the way you know your reflection, unmistakable, intimate, and deeply unnerving when it moves before you do. It rose from beneath the bed in a slow, deliberate cadence, each note pulling at my mind like a thread unraveling a tightly wound coil. My breath came shallow, each exhalation trembling as I sat frozen on the edge of the bed. I wanted to look. My body screamed to move, to see, to confront whatever was beneath, but fear held me in place. And then, as if sensing my hesitation, the voice stopped humming and whispered, "Lewis." It wasn't just my voice anymore. It was layered, discordant, 1,000 versions of me speaking all at once. "Who's there?" I asked, though the words came out strangled. The only reply was laughter, soft, melodic, and utterly wrong. I leapt to my feet, the journal forgotten on the floor, and back toward the door. The shadows around me bent and twisted, stretching into impossible shapes. The hum began again, louder now, vibrating through the floorboards and walls until it felt like the entire room was breathing. "Lewis," the voice called again, this time closer. I turned and ran. The hallway was alive. The lanterns flickered erratically, their light casting jagged, shifting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The floor beneath me groaned and warped, the wooden planks undulating like waves. I stumbled toward the stairs, gripping the banister for balance. The dining room below was pitch black, but I didn't care. Anywhere was better than here. As I reached the bottom step, the hum shifted, its rhythm changing into something almost recognizable. It wasn't random anymore, it was music. A song slow and mournful, each note sinking into my chest like a weight. The air grew colder as I moved toward the door. My fingers fumbled with the latch, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, though I hadn't touched the bolt. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest, but it refused to open. "Lewis." The voice was behind me now. I turned slowly, the hum pressing against me from all sides. The shadows had coalesced in the center of the room, forming a shape, tall and angular, its limbs impossibly long, its head bent at an unnatural angle. Its face, or what passed for a face, was featureless save for a gaping hole where a mouth should have been. And it was singing. No sound came from the hole, but I could feel the song reverberating through me, twisting my thoughts into knots. My memories unraveled, fragments slipping away before I could grasp them. The train ride here, my reason for coming, the places I'd been before. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the song grew louder. The shadow loomed over me, its presence suffocating, and I knew with a certainty that felt older than time that it wasn't just a shadow. It was the hum. It was the song. It was the thing beneath the widow's house, the faces in the stone, the footprints under my bed. It was everything. I don't remember how I got back to my room. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the bed, the lantern flickering on the nightstand. The hum was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt deafening. The journal lay open on the floor, its pages blank, except for a single line written in my hand. "It's inside you now." I slammed the journal shut and threw it into the corner, my chest heaving. The walls of the room seemed closer than before, the ceiling lower, the shadows darker. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my satchel and fled. The town was unrecognizable. The fog had swallowed the streets, the houses little more than vague shapes in the gloom. The fountain was gone, replaced by an empty void that stretched into nothingness. The air buzzed faintly, a lingering echo of the hum that followed me wherever I went. I tried to orient myself, but the town refused to hold its shape. Roads twisted back on themselves, leading me in circles. Buildings appeared and disappeared, their forms shifting like mirages. The only constant was the song, faint and persistent, threading itself through the silence like a needle through cloth. And then I saw them. The children were standing at the edge of the square, their figures barely visible through the fog. They weren't playing now. They were still, their heads tilted upward as though listening to something far above them. "Hey," I called out, my voice cracking. They didn't respond. I moved closer, the cobblestones slick beneath my feet. The children remained motionless, their faces obscured by the haze. When I was close enough to see, I stopped cold. Their eyes were gone. Empty sockets stared back at me, black and bottomless, their edges lined with jagged scars. Their mouths moved in unison, but no sound came out. The song swelled, louder than ever, and the fog around them twisted, coiling into a single massive shape. It rose high above the children, its head tilting toward me, its hollow mouth opening wide. I ran. I didn't know where I was running, only that I had to move. The fog wrapped itself around me, twisting the streets into a labyrinth of stone and shadow. Every step felt like I was sinking further into something alive, something that had been waiting for me all along. The song pursued me, no longer a faint hum, but a melody threaded with countless voices. They overlapped and tangled, some familiar, some alien, all singing in harmony. Each note scraped against my mind, peeling away my thoughts like layers of skin. I reached an intersection I didn't recognize, the cobblestones slick with something dark. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't water. It was black, viscous, and it reeked of rot. The liquid pooled in the cracks of the stones, spreading outward in veins that pulsed faintly with an unnatural rhythm. I stopped, staring at the fountain at the center of the square. It was full now, the black liquid bubbling over its edges, spilling onto the ground like blood from an open wound. The hum vibrated through the air, rising from the fountain's depths. "Lewis." The voice came from everywhere at once, echoing through the square in perfect unison with the song. My name twisted, stretched, and split into fragments, each piece vibrating with a resonance that threatened to pull me apart. I don't know how long I stood there. Time had no meaning anymore. It twisted and looped with every note of the song. When I finally moved, it wasn't because of courage, but because I could feel the ground beneath me beginning to shift. The cobblestones trembled as something stirred beneath them. The liquid in the fountain rippled, and I realized the melody wasn't coming from above or around me. It was rising from below, from the earth itself. The air grew colder as the first tendril emerged. It wasn't a solid thing, but a distortion, like heat waves rising off a summer road. It shimmered and pulsed, bending the light around it as it stretched upward, impossibly tall and angular. More tendrils followed, each one twisting and weaving together into a form that defied reason. And then it took shape. It was wrong. Not monstrous, but impossibly wrong, as though every part of it had been designed to unsettle, to defy understanding. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending backward. Its face, if it had a face, was a void, a gaping absence that radiated hunger. And from that void came the song. I ran again, my legs burning with every step. The streets shifted around me, twisting and collapsing into themselves. Houses rose and fell, their windows blinking like eyes. The fog pressed closer, and with it came the voices. Familiar voices, all calling my name. I tried to shut them out, but they grew louder, each one pulling at a different memory. My childhood, my travels, my arrival in Halford. Each memory twisted and warped, reshaping itself into something unrecognizable. The song wasn't just a sound, it was a force, a predator. It reached into my mind, peeling back layers I didn't know I had, exposing everything I thought was real as fragile and malleable. "Lewis," the voices sang, rising in pitch, "come back to us." I stumbled into the widow's house, slamming the door behind me. The hum faded, muffled by the walls, but I could still feel it vibrating through the floorboards. The trapdoor was open. The air beneath the widow's house was colder than before, thick with the scent of decay. The lantern in my hand sputtered, its light barely illuminating the narrow staircase that spiraled downward. I didn't want to go, but I knew there was no choice. The song had already found me, and it wouldn't stop until I understood. The staircase ended in a cavern, its walls slick with black liquid that reflected the flickering lantern light. Faces pressed against the stone just as they had before, but now they moved. Their eyes followed me, their mouths opening and closing in time with the song. At the center of the cavern stood an altar, crude and ancient, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them. The hum grew louder as I approached, the air around the altar rippling like water. And then I saw it. The singer. It stood behind the altar, its form barely comprehensible. Shadows clung to it, hiding its true shape, but its presence was undeniable. It loomed, its void-like face tilted toward me, and for a moment everything stopped. The song, the hum, even my own breath. It spoke, not in words but in vibrations that sank into my bones, filling me with a truth I couldn't comprehend. "You were never whole." The words shattered me, images flooded my mind. Fragments of lives I didn't recognize, places I'd never been, faces that weren't mine. The song wasn't erasing memories, it was replacing them. I dropped the lantern, its flame extinguishing as it hit the ground. Darkness swallowed the cavern, but the singer's void face remained, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The song swelled, its melody more complex now, layered with harmonies that twisted and writhed. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, clutching my head as the vibrations consumed me. "You belong to the choir," it said. And then I sang. The song poured out of me, unbidden and unstoppable. It wasn't my voice, not entirely. It was layered with others, harmonizing in a language I didn't know, but somehow understood. Each note vibrated through my chest, weaving itself into the hum that pulsed through the cavern. I tried to stop, but my body wasn't mine anymore. My throat burned as the melody grew louder, filling the space until the walls seemed to shudder under its weight. The faces pressed into the stone stared at me, their mouths opening and closing in time with the song. And then they began to move. The first face tore itself free with a sound like wet stone breaking. Its form was incomplete, its body little more than an approximation, patches of flesh and shadow that shifted and reformed with every step. It turned to me, its hollow eyes wide and empty, its mouth stretched into a grotesque imitation of a smile. More followed. One by one, the faces emerged from the walls, their forms half real, their movements disjointed and unnatural. They joined the song, their voices rising in perfect harmony with mine. The singer loomed above them, its void face tilting toward me. The vibrations of its presence rippled through the air, bending reality itself. "You were always one of us," it said, its voice a symphony of dissonance. I tried to speak, to scream, but the song consumed everything. The cavern twisted, the walls stretching and warping, as though the space itself was unraveling. The black liquid seeped upward, forming veins that pulsed through the stone, feeding the growing forms of the creatures around me. They weren't human, not anymore. Each one was a distortion, a hollowed-out echo of something that had once been real. Their faces flickered like candle flames, shifting between identities. Some I recognized, others I didn't. The widow was there. Her form was clearer than the others, her face frozen in an expression of longing and terror. She reached for me, her fingers trembling, but her mouth moved in time with the song, her voice joining the choir. "Sing," she whispered, her words threading through the melody. The altar began to glow, its symbols burning with an otherworldly light. The hum grew louder, shaking the cavern to its foundation, and then I saw it, the source of the song. It rose from the altar, its form impossible to comprehend. It wasn't a single thing, but a collection of parts, each one writhing and shifting in a way that defied logic. Faces emerged and disappeared within its mass, their expressions twisted into screams and laughter. Its body stretched infinitely in all directions, as though it were both here and elsewhere, existing in multiple realities at once. The song wasn't just coming from it, it was it. The truth hit me like a blow. The song wasn't erasing memories or bending reality. It was rewriting existence itself. Every note, every harmony, every vibration shaped the world, turning it into something that served the singer's purpose. And I was part of it now. I don't remember how long I stood there, my voice blending with the choir. Time meant nothing in that place. The song stretched endlessly, each note pulling me further into its grasp. My memories blurred and shifted, fragments of my old life slipping away to be replaced by something else. The faces around me began to fade, their forms dissolving into the black liquid that seeped across the floor. Only the singer remained, its void face watching me with an intensity that burned into my mind. "You belong to the choir," it said again, its voice vibrating through every cell of my being, and for a moment I wanted to believe it. But then I remembered. It wasn't much, just a fragment, a tiny spark of something that didn't fit. A face, a name, a voice that wasn't part of the song. It was mine. With every ounce of strength I had left, I tore my voice from the melody. The song faltered, the harmony breaking as I forced myself to stop singing. The cavern shook violently, cracks spreading through the stone as the liquid hissed and bubbled. The singer recoiled, its form twisting and writhing as it turned toward me. The void face opened wider, its edges splitting into countless tendrils that reached for me. But I was already moving. I ran, my feet splashing through the black liquid as the cavern collapsed around me. The faces in the stone screamed as they dissolved, their voices a discordant cacophony that clashed with the fading hum. The staircase was ahead, its narrow steps slick with liquid and crumbling beneath the strain. I climbed as fast as I could, the song chasing me, its melody fractured but still relentless. When I burst into the widow's house, the trapdoor slammed shut behind me, the hum cutting off abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like a scream. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. My throat burned, my chest ached, and my mind was a fractured mess of images and sounds. But I was free. The town was gone when I stepped outside. The fog had lifted, revealing nothing but empty fields and the remnants of cobblestone streets. The houses, the fountain, the square, everything had vanished, as though it had never been there at all. The hum was faint now, a distant echo that lingered at the edge of my thoughts. It wasn't gone. It would never be gone, but for the first time it didn't control me. I walked away, the song still ringing in my ears, and somewhere deep beneath the earth, the choir sang on. Epilogue. The hum never truly left me. I don't hear it, not in the way I did in that cursed place, but it lingers, faint and insidious, threading through the silence like a parasite waiting to awaken. It's in the way shadows stretch longer than they should, in the moments where I forget why I entered a room, or when the faces of strangers seem almost familiar, their edges blurred by memory's decay. I have left Halford behind, if it ever existed at all, but the song follows. I can feel it, like the pressure of a storm on the horizon, always just out of reach. It vibrates in the quiet moments, in the spaces between breaths, reminding me that silence is never truly silent. Sometimes I dream of the singer. It stands at the edge of my mind, its void-like face tilted toward me in silent invitation. In those dreams, the choir surrounds me, their voices weaving melodies that are too complex to comprehend. Each note twists the air, reshaping the ground beneath my feet into something malleable, fluid, no longer tethered to reality. In those dreams, I sing. When I wake, the notes cling to my tongue like the taste of blood. I tried to return to my work, to bury myself in books and journals, searching for meaning in the myths and stories of others. But every page feels like an echo of what I saw. Fragments of truths that circle the same unspoken thing, something ancient, hungry, and endless. The hum threads itself through these words, reshaping them when I'm not looking. The margins of my notes fill with symbols I don't recognize, words I don't remember writing. It bends the world. You were never whole. Sing. I burn the pages, but the words remain in my mind. There is a theory, ancient, obscure, that the universe was born from sound. That before light, before time, there was vibration, a song so vast and powerful that it shaped reality itself. The first note, the eternal note. What if that note never stopped? What if it echoes still, threading through the fabric of existence, rewriting everything it touches? What if we are not ourselves, but only the song, bent and reshaped with every melody? These questions consume me, but there are no answers. Only the hum, faint and persistent, always there to remind me of what I cannot forget. Sometimes I wonder if I ever truly left. The town, the faces in the stone, the singer. What if they were not confined to Halford? What if they are everywhere, always? What if the world itself is their altar, the ground beneath us their hymn? I hear it in the voices of strangers, in the rhythm of the wind, in the echo of my own thoughts. It sings to me in moments of stillness, when I dare to hope it has finally stopped. It whispers, "You belong to the choir." And sometimes when the world is quiet, I hum back,